When Officer Thomas Reed spots a black man in casual clothes sitting in an old Honda outside a McDonald's, he immediately assumes the worst. What happens next will expose deep-seated prejudices and change lives forever. What Reed doesn't realize is that James Carter isn't casing the restaurant. He owns it. Not just this location, but 100 McDonald's franchises across the state. As their confrontation escalates from the parking lot into the restaurant itself, Reed makes a critical error that will be captured on dozens of phones and shared across social media. But James Carter isn't interested in public humiliation or revenge. He sees an opportunity for something more powerful: real change. This is a story about assumptions, dignity, and the possibility of transformation, even in the face of injustice. James Carter woke up as the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains. He stretched his arms and smiled at his wife Maya, who was still fast asleep beside him. Their bedroom was spacious, but not flashy. James never cared much for showing off, even though he could afford the finest things. He slipped out of bed quietly and headed to the bathroom. After a quick shower, he put on a plain blue t-shirt and his favorite pair of jeans. Today was inspection day, and James liked to dress casually when he visited his restaurants. It helped him blend in and see how things really worked when employees didn't know the boss was watching. "Morning, Dad," his daughter Zoe called as he walked into the kitchen. At 12 years old, she was already at the table eating cereal and reading a book. "Good morning, sunshine," James replied, ruffling her curly hair. "Where's your brother?" "Still getting ready," Zoe said, not looking up from her book. "He spent way too long on his video game last night." James chuckled and started making coffee. His son Marcus stumbled into the kitchen a few minutes later, looking sleepy. "You're going to be late for school again," James said, passing his son a glass of orange juice. "Sorry, Dad," Marcus mumbled, grabbing a piece of toast. At 15, he was growing taller every day and always hungry. Maya joined them, dressed in her doctor's coat. She kissed James on the cheek and poured herself coffee. "Which restaurants are you visiting today?" she asked, starting with the one on Maple Street, then heading over to West Side and finishing at Oak Lane, James answered. "I haven't been to the Maple Street location in months. Want to make sure everything's running smoothly." Maya nodded. "Just be careful in that neighborhood. It's been getting rough lately." "I grew up in a neighborhood rougher than that," James reminded her with a smile. "I'll be fine." After breakfast, they all headed out together. James hugged his kids before they got on the school bus, and he kissed Maya goodbye as she got into her new SUV. "Love you," she said. "Call me later?" "Always do," he promised. Instead of taking his BMW or the new Tesla Maya had surprised him with for his birthday, James got into his old Honda Civic. It was reliable and didn't attract attention. Perfect for surprise inspections. As he drove, James thought about how far he'd come. Growing up, his family had barely had enough money for rent, let alone extras. His first job had been at a McDonald's when he was 16. He had worked hard, saved every penny, and eventually managed to buy his first franchise at 28. Now, 20 years later, he owned 100 McDonald's restaurants across the state. The morning traffic was light, and James turned on the radio. The news was full of stories about protests in the city after another incident involving police and a young black man. James sighed. These stories hit close to home. He'd had his own run-ins with police who saw his skin before they saw him as a person. "One day it'll be different," he said to himself, thinking of his son. One day, he pulled into the parking lot of a small strip mall and parked in a regular space, far from the McDonald's entrance. The restaurant looked okay from the outside, but James noticed the sign needed cleaning, and there was trash in the bushes. He made a few notes on his phone before getting out of the car. This location had been struggling lately. Sales were down, and customer complaints were up. James wanted to see why for himself before making any changes. From his car, he could see a few morning customers inside. An elderly man reading a newspaper, a mom with 2 small children, a couple of guys in work, uniforms grabbing breakfast before their shift. James checked the time, 8:45 a.m. The morning rush would be ending soon. Perfect timing to see how the staff handled the transition to lunch prep while still serving breakfast customers. He stayed in his car for a few more minutes, reviewing the store's latest numbers on his phone. The profit margins had dropped 5% over the last quarter. Employee turnover was high, with 3 managers in the past year. Something wasn't working. Outside his window, a police car cruised slowly through the parking lot. James didn't pay much attention. Police regularly patrolled this area. He put his phone in his pocket and reached for his notebook in the glove compartment. In it, he kept a checklist for every visit. James believed in being thorough. Maya often teased him about his old-school approach, preferring paper over digital apps. But it worked for him. James took a deep breath and prepared to head inside. These surprise visits always made him a little nervous. Even after all these years, he wanted his restaurants to succeed, his employees to thrive, and his customers to be happy. He had no idea that this regular morning was about to become anything but regular. Officer Thomas Reed drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his patrol car. He was in a foul mood. His morning had started with yet another argument with his 17-year-old son, Tyler. "You can't tell me what to do anymore," Tyler had shouted before slamming his bedroom door. The memory made Reed's jaw tighten. 15 years on the force, and he couldn't even control his own son. What was the world coming to? His partner had called in sick today, so Reed was patrolling alone. Sometimes he preferred it this way. No one to question his methods or give him those looks when he got tough with troublemakers. Reed took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. It was cold now. He tossed it into the empty cup holder and continued his slow drive through the shopping center parking lot. This neighborhood had changed over the last few years. Reed didn't like the changes. Too many new faces. Too many people who didn't seem to respect authority. "Just asking for trouble," he muttered to himself. His radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice, but it was a call for another unit. Reed had been hoping for some action to improve his mood. Something to remind people that the law still meant something in this town. As he rounded the corner of the strip mall, Reed noticed a man sitting in an older Honda. The man was looking at his phone, then writing something down. Reed slowed his patrol car. Something about the scene bothered him. Why was this guy just sitting there? Was he casing the McDonald's? Maybe dealing drugs? Reed had seen it before. Criminals getting bolder, operating right out in the open. Not on his watch. He pulled his patrol car behind the Honda, blocking it in. Reed noticed the man was black, wearing casual clothes. Now the guy was reaching into his glove compartment. "Perfect," Reed said under his breath, unbuckling his seatbelt. He adjusted his belt and made sure his badge was visible. Reed believed in making an impression. Before getting out, he called in the license plate number. The dispatcher quickly responded that the car was registered to someone named James Carter. No warrants, no flags. That didn't mean anything to Reed. Criminals were getting smarter these days, using clean cars, flying under the radar. He stepped out of his patrol car and approached the Honda, hand resting near his weapon. Reed put on what his fellow officers called his cop face. Stern, unsmiling, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, even though the day was cloudy. The man in the car was still looking down, unaware of Reed's approach. Reed tapped on the window. With his knuckles harder than necessary. The man looked up, startled. Reed could see him quickly recovering his composure, putting down his notebook, and reaching to roll down the window. "Can I help you, officer?" the man asked politely. There was something about his calm tone that irritated Reed even more. Too calm, like he had nothing to worry about, like he was above suspicion. "License and registration," Reed demanded, not bothering to explain why he was asking. "May I ask what this is about?" the man questioned, his voice still even. "Just routine," Reed said flatly. "You've been sitting here a while, looking suspicious." The man raised his eyebrows, but reached slowly for his wallet. "I'm just reviewing some notes before going into the McDonald's." "What business do you have there?" Reed pressed, taking the offered license. "James Carter," just as the dispatcher had said. "Address in the wealthy part of town." What was he doing here? "I'm checking on the restaurant," Carter replied. "Checking on it? What does that mean? You work there?" Reed asked, skepticism heavy in his voice. This guy didn't look like a McDonald's employee, and if he was, why was he sitting out here instead of being inside working? "Something like that," Carter said with a small smile. That smile pushed Reed over the edge. He was being played with, and Reed hated feeling mocked. "Step out of the car, sir," he ordered, stepping back and placing his hand more visibly on his weapon. Carter's smile disappeared. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just out of the car." "Now," Reed cut him off. "Or are you refusing to comply with an officer's orders?" Slowly, Carter opened his door and stepped out. He was taller than Reed had expected and dressed simply, but in clothes that looked expensive upon closer inspection. "I'm going to go into McDonald's now," Carter said firmly. "You're welcome to join me if you have more questions." Reed didn't like being the one following, but he wasn't about to let this guy out of his sight. Something wasn't right here, and Officer Thomas Reed trusted his gut. As they walked toward the restaurant entrance, Reed stayed close behind Carter. This morning was finally getting interesting. James could feel the officer's presence behind him, too close for comfort. The weight of being watched, judged, and followed was familiar to him. Even after all his success, some things hadn't changed. "Sir, I'd still like to know your exact business here," Reed said as they approached the doors. James stopped and turned to face the officer. "I told you, I'm checking on the restaurant." "Are you meeting someone? Picking something up?" Reed pressed. "Most people don't sit in their cars writing notes before getting breakfast." James took a deep breath. He could explain that he owned the place, but something held him back. Years of experience had taught him that revealing his success too quickly sometimes made situations worse, not better. "I'm here to observe how the restaurant is running," James said finally. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go inside." The glass doors of the McDonald's slid open as they approached. The smell of coffee and breakfast sandwiches filled the air. A few customers looked up briefly before returning to their meals. The restaurant was clean but clearly aging. The floor tiles were worn in spots, and some of the booth seats needed replacing. James noted these details automatically, adding them to his mental checklist. Reed followed James inside, staying uncomfortably close. "You still haven't explained why you're observing a McDonald's," he said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. An elderly woman glanced up from her coffee. A man in a business suit frowned over his newspaper. A young mother pulled her children closer. James felt his face grow warm. He wasn't embarrassed for himself, but for the officer creating a scene. He also worried about how this might affect his staff and customers. "Officer, could we discuss this more quietly?" James suggested in a low voice. "I'll ask the questions how I want to ask them," Reed replied, his voice even louder. "What's your connection to this establishment?" The cashier, a young woman with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, watched them nervously. James didn't recognize her. She must be new. The morning shift manager should be around somewhere, but James didn't see them. "I have a professional interest in this location," James said carefully. He moved toward an empty table, hoping Reed would follow and they could sit down. Being questioned while standing in the middle of the restaurant was drawing too much attention. Reed didn't take the hint. He stepped in front of James, blocking his path. "Professional interest? What does that mean exactly? Are you from corporate or something?" James considered how to answer. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to reveal his ownership yet. Sometimes employees behaved differently when they knew the owner was watching. James wanted to see how things really ran day to day. "Yes, I'm here to check on operations," James said. It wasn't untrue. Reed's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses, which he still hadn't removed despite being indoors. "Let me see some ID for that. Employee badge? Business card?" James hadn't brought his business cards. He rarely needed them these days, and certainly hadn't expected to today. "I don't have those with me, but I can assure you..." "So you have no proof you're supposed to be here," Reed cut him off. The cashier was now openly staring. So were several customers. A teenage boy had his phone out, possibly recording. James felt the situation slipping out of control. "Officer Reed," James said, reading the name badge, "I understand you're doing your job, but this is becoming disruptive. I have every right to be here." "How do you know I'm just doing my job?" Reed shot back. "Maybe I think something's not right about you or your story." A flash of anger rose in James, but he pushed it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help. "What exactly do you find suspicious about me eating breakfast at McDonald's?" he asked evenly. "You weren't eating. You were sitting in your car watching the place. Now you're claiming to be here officially, but have no ID. That's suspicious behavior." James looked around the restaurant again, hoping to spot a manager or any employee who might recognize him. The place was busier than he'd expected for this time of morning. Most tables were filled, and there was a small line at the counter now. "ID. Like to speak to the manager," James said finally. Reed smirked. "Oh, now you want to speak to the manager? I thought you said you were from corporate." "I never said I was from corporate," James corrected him. "I said I'm here to check on operations." A young woman in a McDonald's manager uniform emerged from the back. Her name tag read Sarah. James didn't recognize her either. She looked concerned as she approached them. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes darting between James and Officer Reed. Before James could answer, Reed spoke up. "This man claims to have some official business here, but he can't provide any identification. Says he's checking on operations or something." Sarah looked at James uncertainly. "I'm sorry, but I don't recognize you. Are you from the franchise office?" This was James's chance to clear everything up. He could simply explain who he was. The manager would apologize. The officer would be embarrassed. Everyone could move on with their day. But as James opened his mouth to speak, he noticed Reed's hand moving to rest on his weapon. The subtle threat in that gesture made James's words die in his throat. Years of being treated with suspicion because of his skin color flooded back. Why should he have to prove himself? Why should he have to announce his success to be treated with basic respect? "I'd just like to order breakfast," James said instead. "If that's allowed." Reed's face hardened. "Now your story's changing. First, you're here on business. Now you just want breakfast?" James met Reed's gaze steadily. "I can have more than one reason to be here, can't I?" The line between Reed's eyebrows deepened. He didn't like James's calm responses, or the way several customers were now openly watching their interaction. "Step outside with me," Reed ordered. "We need to continue this conversation privately." James shook his head. "I don't think that's necessary, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." The manager, Sarah, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Maybe I can help sort this out," she offered timidly. Reed ignored her. "Sir, I'm not asking. I'm telling you to step outside." By now, everyone in the restaurant was watching. The normal breakfast chatter had died down. Even the kitchen staff had paused, their work to peek through the service window. "I prefer to stay inside," James said firmly. "If you have concerns, we can discuss them here." James noticed a young employee staring at him from behind the counter. The boy's eyes were wide, as if trying to place where he'd seen James before. Reed's face flushed with anger. "You don't get to decide how this goes. When an officer gives you an order, you follow it." "Excuse me," said an elderly man from a nearby booth. "What has this gentleman done wrong?" "This doesn't concern you, sir," Reed snapped without looking at him. "Police business." The elderly man frowned but went back to his breakfast. James decided to try a different approach. "Officer Reed, I understand you're concerned, but I assure you everything is fine. Why don't I just order some food, and we can sit down and talk?" "Now you're trying to tell me how to do my job?" Reed's voice grew louder. "That's not how this works." Sarah stepped closer, gathering her courage. "Officer, would it help if I confirmed whether this gentleman is allowed to be here?" "And how would you do that?" Reed asked skeptically. "He already admitted he doesn't have ID." "I could call my district supervisor," Sarah suggested. She turned to James. "Sir, who should I say is asking about the restaurant?" This was James's chance again. He could simply say, "Tell them it's James Carter, the owner." But the way Reed was behaving made him hesitate. The officer seemed determined to find a problem, and James wasn't sure revealing his ownership would improve the situation. "James Carter," he said finally. "Just tell them James Carter is here." Sarah nodded and walked quickly toward the back office. Reed moved to block James from following her. "You stay right here," Reed demanded. "Don't move." James stood still, aware of all the eyes on him. He felt a familiar mix of emotions: anger at being treated this way, determination to maintain his dignity, and a tired sadness that these situations still happened, no matter how successful he became. A teenage girl at a nearby table was recording everything on her phone. A few other customers had their phones out too. James knew this would likely end up online. Another viral video of a black man being harassed by police. "Officer," James said quietly, "you're making a scene in this restaurant. This isn't necessary." "I'll determine what's necessary," Reed replied. "And right now, you're being uncooperative." The young employee, who had been staring at James earlier, whispered something to his co-worker. The other worker's eyes widened, and she looked at James with new interest. Sarah returned from the office, looking flustered. "I left a message for my supervisor, but he didn't pick up. It's his day off." Reed smiled slightly, as if this confirmed his suspicions. "Convenient. So there's no one who can verify your story right now." James remained calm. "When does the morning rush end?" he asked Sarah. The question seemed to confuse both Sarah and Reed. About 10:30, Sarah answered, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was 9:15. "And how many employees do you have on shift during breakfast hours?" James continued. Sarah blinked. 8 on weekdays, 10 on weekends." "And what's your average ticket time for drive-through orders?" "Around 2 minutes and 15 seconds, Sarah replied automatically, then looked confused about why she was answering these questions. Reed stepped between them. "That's enough. What kind of game are you playing? James looked directly at Reed. I'm not playing any game. I'm simply demonstrating that I know this business. Knowing a few facts about McDonald's doesn't prove anything, Reed said dismissively. Anyone could know that stuff. The young employee who had been watching suddenly approached. His name tag read Marcus. Excuse me, Marcus said nervously, but I think I recognize you, sir. Reed turned to glare at him. Stay out of this, kid. Marcus hesitated, looking between James and the officer. James caught Marcus's eye and gave a slight shake of his head. He wasn't ready to be identified yet. Something told him to wait. Marcus backed away, returning to his position behind the counter. Now, Reed said, turning back to James, for the last time, I need you to step outside with me. And for the last time, James replied calmly, I haven't done anything wrong. I have every right to be here. The tension in the restaurant was thick. Customers were watching with a mix of concern and curiosity. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry on James's behalf. What's happening? A woman with 2 small children asked loudly. Why is that officer bothering that man? Mommy, is that man in trouble? One of the children asked. No, sweetheart, the woman answered, glaring at Reed. I don't think he's done anything wrong. Reed's jaw tightened. James could see the officer didn't like having his authority questioned, especially in front of an audience. Sarah tried again to defuse the situation. Officer, maybe I could try my regional director? He might know if Mr. Carter is supposed to be here. Before Reed could respond, the door chimed as more customers entered. A group of construction workers, covered in dust from a nearby job site, walked in laughing. They stopped abruptly when they sensed the tension. What's going on? One of them asked, looking around. That cop is hassling that guy for no reason, someone answered from a nearby table. Reed's face darkened. That's enough. Everyone mind your own business. The elderly man who had spoken earlier stood up shakily. Young man, he said to Reed, I'm a retired judge, and I believe you're overstepping your authority. Reed turned to the old man, eyes flashing. Sir, return to your seat, or I'll have to ask you to leave as well. Are you threatening me? The old man asked, raising his bushy white eyebrows. James saw things spiraling out of control. Please, he said to the elderly man, I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle this. The old man nodded reluctantly and sat back down, still watching carefully. Reed turned back to James, anger clear on his face. That's it. You're coming outside with me now, or I'm placing you under arrest for interfering with an officer. Interfering? James asked incredulously. I've been nothing but cooperative. I've answered your questions. I've stayed calm. Your definition of cooperative and mine are very different, Reed said, reaching for James's arm. James stepped back, avoiding Reed's grasp. Please don't touch me, officer. Reed's face hardened. Are you resisting? I'm not resisting anything, James said clearly, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'm simply asking you not to put your hands on me when I've done nothing wrong. Several customers had their phones out now, recording the interaction. The teenage girl who had been filming earlier stood up for a better angle. Everyone stay back, Reed commanded, looking around the restaurant. This is police business. Sarah, the manager, was frantically dialing on her phone again. I'm trying to reach someone who can help, she said to no one in particular. Reed turned back to James. Last chance. Come outside willingly, or you're leaving in handcuffs. James took a deep breath. He thought about his children, about what they would think if they saw their father in handcuffs. He thought about his wife Maya, about the fear she would feel if someone sent her a video of this scene. He thought about his employees, about the example he wanted to set. "Officer Reed," James said, his voice firm but respectful. "I don't understand why you're treating me this way. I came here this morning to check on one of my restaurants. I've answered your questions. I've been polite. What exactly do you suspect me of doing?" "One of your restaurants?" Reed repeated, skepticism heavy in his voice. "Now you own the place. Your story keeps changing." "My story hasn't changed," James replied. "I never said I didn't own it. You assumed I didn't." Marcus, the young employee who had recognized James earlier, stepped forward again. "Sir, he's telling the truth. That's Mr. Carter. I saw him in our training videos." Reed glanced at Marcus, then back at James. "Training videos? So you're what? Some kind of corporate trainer?" James was about to respond when Reed suddenly grabbed his arm, his grip tight and unexpected. "We're taking this outside! Now!" The move caught James off guard. He instinctively pulled back, which made Reed tighten his grip. "Stop resisting!" Reed shouted, yanking James toward the door. "I'm not resisting," James replied, trying to keep his balance as Reed pulled him. "You're assaulting me!" Several customers stood up. The elderly retired judge called out, "Officer, you have no grounds for this action." A woman with her children started crying, "This is wrong! Someone do something!" Reed ignored them all, focused entirely on dragging James toward the exit. James wasn't fighting back, but he wasn't making it easy either. He planted his feet, making himself heavy and difficult to move. "You have no right to do this," James said loudly, wanting everyone to hear. "I have done nothing wrong." Sarah was in full panic mode now. "Please, officer, there must be some mistake." She rushed back to the office, presumably to keep trying to reach a supervisor. The kitchen staff had completely abandoned their posts to watch the scene unfold. The restaurant had fallen into chaos. Marcus followed behind Reed and James. "Officer, please stop. That's Mr. Carter. He owns this store and like 100 others." Reed paused for a moment, looking at Marcus with suspicion. "Kid, stay out of this. You don't know what you're talking about." "I do know," Marcus insisted. "They showed us his picture during orientation. He's the owner." Reed hesitated, but only briefly. "Nice try. But if he's the owner, why didn't he say so right away? Why was he sitting in his car watching the place like he was casing it?" James could have explained. He could have told Reed about his inspection routine, about how he liked to observe his restaurants anonymously first. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Reed had decided who James was the moment he saw him. "Let go of me," James said quietly, looking directly into Reed's eyes. "You're making a serious mistake." Reed responded by tightening his grip and pulling James roughly toward the door again. "The only mistake was you thinking you could lie to a police officer." By now, most of the customers had stood up. Some were filming. Others were calling out in protest. The construction workers who had entered earlier formed a loose circle around Reed and James, not interfering, but clearly watching with disapproval. "This ain't right," one of them muttered loudly. Sarah returned from the office, her face pale. "I got through to the district supervisor. He's on his way. He says to tell you to stop immediately, officer. He says Mr. Carter really is the owner." Reed froze, still holding James's arm. "What?" "Miguel is coming right now," Sarah continued breathlessly. "He says Mr. Carter owns this restaurant. He owns all the McDonald's in this region." A murmur spread through the restaurant. Some customers looked surprised. Others nodded, as if they'd suspected all along. Reed's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. "I need confirmation from someone official, not just the word of a restaurant manager." James had remained calm throughout, but his patience was wearing thin. "Officer Reed, you've caused enough of a scene. Let go of my arm. Now." Something in James's tone made Reed hesitate. There was authority there, the kind that came naturally to someone used to being in charge. "If you really are the owner," Reed said, not quite ready to back down, "why were you sitting in your car watching the place? Why didn't you just come in and announce yourself?" "Because that's not how I do things," James replied. "I like to see how my restaurants operate when no one knows I'm watching. It gives me a true picture." Reed still looked doubtful. "Monchidiri Tamrin Sintantrai Twain. You expect me to believe a McDonald's owner drives an old Honda and wears jeans and a t-shirt?" Several customers scoffed at this. The elderly judge spoke up again. "Young man, wealth doesn't always announce itself with flashy cars and expensive suits. Some of the wealthiest people I know dress simply." Reed's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I still need to verify your identity," Reed insisted, pulling James again. "We're going outside to my patrol car." James had enough. "No, we're not. You're going to let go of my arm right now." "Or what?" Reed challenged. James looked him straight in the eye. "Or I'm going to make a phone call that will end your career." The restaurant went silent. Everyone heard the quiet confidence in James's voice. "Are you threatening a police officer?" Reed asked, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I'm stating a fact," James replied calmly. "Let go of my arm, or things will get much worse for you." Reed hesitated, caught in a situation he no longer controlled. His training told him to maintain authority, but his instincts were finally warning him that something was very wrong. Before Reed could decide, the door to the restaurant opened again. A man in a suit rushed in, looking around frantically. When he spotted James and Reed, he hurried over. "Mr. Carter!" the man exclaimed. "What's happening here? Are you okay?" It was Miguel, the district supervisor. He looked both worried and confused as he took in the scene before him. Reed's grip on James's arm finally loosened. His face showed the first signs of genuine uncertainty. "Miguel," James said calmly, "this officer seems to think I'm up to something suspicious. He's been trying to remove me from the premises." Miguel looked shocked. "Officer, there's been a huge misunderstanding. This is James Carter. He owns this McDonald's." Reed let go of James's arm completely, but didn't step back. He was sitting in his car watching the place, refused to properly identify himself. "I didn't refuse anything," James corrected. "I answered all your questions. You just didn't like my answers." The restaurant remained unusually quiet. Every customer, every employee was watching the scene unfold. Their expressions ranged from anger to sympathy to curiosity. A young mother stood nearby, her arms wrapped protectively around her two small children. She had been shielding their eyes during the confrontation, trying to turn their faces away from the ugliness of what was happening. "Come on, babies," she whispered, gathering her things. "We're going to eat somewhere else today." As she hurried her children toward the door, she paused beside James. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said softly. "My kids shouldn't have to see this kind of thing still happening." James nodded gratefully at her words. She gave Officer Reed a withering look before leaving. The teenage girl who had been recording everything was still filming. She had positioned herself to capture both James and Reed in the same frame. Her live stream had already gathered hundreds of viewers. "This is going viral right now," she announced to no one in particular. "Everyone's sharing it." Reed's face paled slightly at her words. He finally seemed to realize how bad this looked. The elderly retired judge hadn't moved from his spot. He sat watching everything with sharp eyes, occasionally making notes on a napkin with a pen he'd pulled from his pocket. "Young man," he called to James, "I'd be happy to serve as a witness if you need one." "Thank you, sir," James replied with dignity. "I appreciate that." Marcus, the young employee who had recognized James from the training videos, still stood nearby. He looked nervously between James and Officer Reed. "Mr. Carter," he said hesitantly, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I wasn't sure at first. And then, when I was sure, I saw you shake your head." James smiled at him kindly. "You did the right thing, Marcus. Thank you for trying to help." Miguel was on his phone now, speaking rapidly. "Yes, sir. Mr. Carter is here." "No, he's okay. But there was an incident with a police officer." "Yes, I think that would be good." "Thank you." He hung up and turned to James. "The regional director is on his way. So is Rick from PR." James nodded. The situation was quickly growing. Beyond what he had anticipated for his morning inspection, he looked around at the restaurant, at all the witnesses to what had just happened. The construction workers still stood in their loose circle, their expressions hard as they looked at Officer Reed. "Man, this is exactly what happened to my brother last year," one of them said. "Cops see a black man and assume he's up to no good." Another construction worker nodded. "Same thing happened to me outside my own house. Neighbor called the cops because she didn't recognize me. Been living there 3 years," Reed shifted uncomfortably. The witnesses weren't just observing anymore. They were sharing their own stories, finding common ground in their experiences. The teenage girl with the phone had stopped narrating to her audience and was now interviewing other customers. "So, what did you see happen here today?" she asked the construction workers. "We saw a cop harassing a black business owner for no reason," one answered without hesitation. "Same old story." Sarah, the manager, looked close to tears. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. If I had recognized you right away." James shook his head. "This isn't your fault, Sarah. You handled it well." The kitchen staff had cautiously returned to their stations, but they kept glancing over, watching everything unfold. One older cook shook his head sadly, as if he'd seen this kind of thing too many times before. Reed finally broke his silence. "Mr. Carter, if there's been a misunderstanding—" "Misunderstanding," James repeated, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Reed, you saw a black man sitting in a car and immediately assumed I was doing something wrong. That's not a misunderstanding. That's prejudice." The restaurant grew even quieter, if that was possible. Reed's face hardened again. "I was responding to suspicious behavior, not skin color." "Was I really suspicious?" James asked. "Or did I just look suspicious to you because of who I am?" Before Reed could answer, the door opened again. A well-dressed man in his 50s entered the restaurant, followed by a younger man carrying a laptop case. They both headed straight for James. "James," the older man said, extending his hand. "Richard Thompson, Regional Director. Are you all right?" James shook his hand. "I'm fine, Richard. Thank you for coming so quickly." The younger man opened his laptop on a nearby table. "We're already seeing social media activity about this, Mr. Carter. Several videos are circulating." Reed watched this exchange with growing alarm. He was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated. The witnesses had seen everything, and now the world was watching too. Richard Thompson, the regional director, placed a protective hand on James's shoulder. "Let's sit down," he suggested, guiding James to a nearby table. Officer Reed stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure what to do next. His radio crackled, and he turned away slightly to respond in a low voice. Miguel was still on his phone, updating someone about the situation. Yes, Mr. Carter is here with Richard now. The officer is still here too. The PR manager, whose name tag read Rick, looked up from his laptop with concern. Mr. Carter, the videos are spreading quickly. Would you like to make a statement? James shook his head. Not yet. I need to make a call first. Rick nodded and returned to monitoring the social media response. The teenage girl who had been live streaming approached their table cautiously. Mr. Carter, she said. My name is Zoe. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry this happened to you. My dad is black, and he's had similar experiences. James smiled at her. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for documenting what happened here today. Zoe nodded earnestly. People need to see this stuff. It's not right. Officer Reed finally approached the table. Mr. Carter, I need to speak with you. Richard stepped between them. I don't think that's appropriate right now, officer. Reed's jaw tightened. This is police business. No, James said firmly. This stopped being police business the moment you decided I was suspicious based on nothing but prejudice. Reed's face flushed. That's not what happened. I was responding to... I'd like to make a phone call, James interrupted, pulling out his cell phone. With your permission, of course. His tone made it clear he wasn't really asking for permission. Reed hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Go ahead. The restaurant had returned to a semblance of normal operation. Customers were eating again, though most kept glancing over at James's table. The kitchen staff had resumed cooking, and Sarah was back at the register helping customers. Marcus hovered nearby, clearly wanting to be useful but unsure what to do. James caught his eye and gave him a reassuring nod. James scrolled through his contacts and found the number he was looking for. He hit the call button and put the phone to his ear. Who are you calling? Reed asked suspiciously. Your lawyer? James simply held up one finger, asking for silence as the call connected. Hello, Michael? It's James Carter, he said into the phone. I'm sorry to bother you on a workday, but I've run into a situation I think you should know about. Reed watched, with growing unease as James continued the conversation. I'm at my McDonald's franchise on Maple Street, James explained. One of your officers, Thomas Reed, has been detaining me and attempted to forcibly remove me from my own restaurant. Reed's eyes widened as he began to realize who James might be speaking with. No, I'm fine, James continued. But Officer Reed seemed convinced I was suspicious, simply for sitting in my car and then entering my own business. James paused, listening to the response. Yes, that's right. He grabbed my arm and tried to drag me out, even after I explained who I was. Reed shifted uncomfortably. The other McDonald's executives watched him with cold expressions. Michael, you know I wouldn't call you for something trivial, James said. We've known each other too long for that. But this needs to be addressed. Another pause as James listened. You will? Thank you. We'll be here. James ended the call and placed his phone on the table. He looked at Reed calmly. That was Police Chief Johnson, James said. He'll be here in 10 minutes. The color drained from Reed's face. You know the chief? We've been friends for 20 years, James replied. We started the youth basketball program together back when he was just a patrol officer. My family and his have dinner together at least once a month. Reed looked stunned. I didn't. You never said, should I have to? James asked. Should I have to name-drop my connections to be treated with basic respect? Reed had no answer for that. Richard leaned toward James. Do you want me to call Maya? He asked quietly. James shook his head. Not yet. She has surgeries scheduled all morning. I don't want to worry her until this is resolved. Rick looked up from his laptop again. The story is gaining traction, Mr. Carter. Local news is picking it up. James sighed. This was becoming exactly what he had wanted to avoid. A public spectacle. But perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps people needed to see what happened when someone like him, despite all his success, was judged solely by the color of his skin. "Officer Reed," James said, "I'm curious. What did you think was happening when you saw me in my car?" Reed hesitated before answering. "The neighborhood has had break-ins. Someone casing a restaurant might sit outside, watching patterns, taking notes. And it couldn't possibly be the owner checking on his business?" James asked. "Owners don't usually drive old cars and wear casual clothes," Reed replied defensively. James smiled without humor. "Some of us remember where we came from, Officer Reed. Some of us don't feel the need to flaunt our success." The elderly retired judge approached their table, leaning on his cane. "Mr. Carter, I've written down my contact information. I witnessed the entire incident and would be willing to provide a statement if needed." He handed James a napkin with his name and phone number. "Thank you, Judge Williams," James said, reading the name. "I appreciate your support." The judge nodded and returned to his table, where he continued to watch everything with sharp eyes. Outside, sirens could be heard approaching. Reed looked toward the sound with growing alarm. "James," Richard said quietly, "how do you want to handle this? The company will support whatever decision you make." James considered the question carefully. He thought about his children and what he had always taught them about standing up for what's right. He thought about his employees and the example he wanted to set. He thought about all the people who had experienced similar treatment, but didn't have his resources or connections. "I want accountability," James said finally. "Not revenge, but real change." The sirens grew louder. "They're here," Miguel said, looking out the window. 3 police cars pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. Customers and employees gathered at the windows to watch as several officers emerged, led by a tall man in a chief's uniform. Officer Reed squared his shoulders and took a deep breath, preparing to face the consequences of his actions. The restaurant door swung open. Chief Michael Johnson entered first, followed by a woman in a commander's uniform and another officer. The chief scanned the room quickly, his expression serious. When his eyes landed on James, his face softened with concern. "James," he said, striding across the restaurant. "Are you all right?" James stood to greet him. "I'm fine, Michael. Thank you for coming so quickly." The 2 men shook hands, and the chief placed a supportive hand on James's shoulder. Their familiarity was obvious to everyone watching. Officer Reed stood stiffly nearby, his face an unreadable mask. The woman in the commander's uniform approached him. "Officer Reed," she said, her voice cold. "Step outside with Officer Daniels, please." Reed glanced at James once more before following the other officer out of the restaurant. Through the windows, customers could see the commander speaking to Reed in the parking lot, her expression stern. Chief Johnson turned to the remaining customers and employees. "Folks, I apologize for the disruption to your morning. We're handling this situation. Please continue your meals." Most people returned to their food, though many kept watching from the corners of their eyes. The teenage girl, Zoe, was still, recording everything. "Michael, this is Richard Thompson, our regional director," James said, introducing the chief to the McDonald's executives. "And this is Miguel Santos, the district supervisor, and Rick from our PR department." They all shook hands, and the chief pulled up a chair to join them at the table. "Tell me exactly what happened," Chief Johnson said. James recounted the morning's events calmly and clearly. He described how Reed had approached him in his car, followed him into the restaurant, questioned him aggressively, and eventually tried to physically remove him. As James spoke, The chief's expression darkened. "This is unacceptable," he said when James finished. "Completely unacceptable." Richard nodded in agreement. "We're already seeing significant social media attention. Videos of the incident are spreading." Rick turned his laptop so the chief could see the screens of posts and comments. "It's trending locally now. Probably will go national within hours." The chief sighed heavily. "James, I want to apologize personally for Officer Reed's behavior. This is not how our officers are trained to act." "I know that, Michael," James replied. "But this isn't just about me. What about people who don't have my resources, who don't know the chief of police personally?" The chief nodded grimly. "You're right. This highlights a bigger problem." Outside, more vehicles pulled into the parking lot. A black SUV with tinted windows parked next to the police cars. A woman in an expensive suit emerged, followed by a man carrying a briefcase. "That's our corporate legal team," Richard explained, looking out the window. News travels fast. The woman entered the restaurant and made her way directly to their table. "Mr. Carter," she said professionally, "I'm Amanda Lewis, head of legal for the Northeast region. We were notified of the incident." James introduced her to the chief, and they quickly brought her up to speed on the situation. From a legal standpoint, Amanda said, "You have several options, Mr. Carter. We can pursue action against the officer individually, against the department, or both. The company will support whatever decision you make." James thought carefully. "What's most important to me is ensuring this doesn't happen to others." The commander who had been speaking with Reed outside returned to the restaurant. She approached the chief and spoke quietly in his ear. The chief's expression grew even more serious. "District Commander Harper tells me that Officer Reed has a history of similar complaints," Chief Johnson said. "Nothing that resulted in formal discipline, but there's a pattern." James wasn't surprised. That's often how these situations go. Small incidents add up over time, but nothing is ever done until something big happens. Sarah, the restaurant manager, approached the table hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, the breakfast shift is ending, and we need to switch over to the lunch menu. Should we continue normal operations?" James appreciated her professionalism despite the chaos. "Yes, Sarah. Business as usual. Your team is doing a great job under difficult circumstances." Sarah nodded gratefully and returned to her staff. James watched as she gathered the employees for a quick meeting, probably explaining how to handle curious customers and keep things running smoothly. The construction workers who had witnessed everything were getting up to leave. One of them stopped by James's table. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we want you to know we got your back. We all saw what happened. My cousin works at one of your other restaurants. Says you're a good boss who treats people right." "Thank you," James replied, touched by the support. "I appreciate that." As the workers left, more people entered, lunch customers who had no idea about the morning's events. They looked curiously at the gathering of police and executives, but went about ordering their food. Marcus, the young employee who had recognized James, was now working the register. He handled each customer professionally, not mentioning the incident unless they asked. "You have a good team here," James commented to Miguel. "Even under pressure, they're doing well." Miguel nodded. "Most of them are new. Sarah just took over as manager last month after the previous one left." Through the windows, James could see Officer Reed sitting in one of the police cars. The officer's face was tight with anger and embarrassment. Amanda, the legal counsel, was reviewing something on her tablet. "Mr. Carter, I've been looking at Officer Reed's record. This incident, combined with his history, could lead to serious consequences for him." "What kind of consequences?" James asked. "Potentially termination," the chief answered honestly. At minimum, suspension and retraining. James considered this. He didn't want Reed's career destroyed, but he also believed in accountability. "I don't want him fired," James said finally, "but I do want him to understand why his actions were wrong. Real understanding, not just going through the motions." The chief nodded. "I respect that, James. What would you suggest?" Before James could answer, the door opened again. A man and woman in press badges entered, followed by a camera operator. "Looks like the local news is here," Rick said, standing up. "I'll intercept them." Richard turned to James. "This is getting bigger by the minute. We should consider making a formal statement soon." James nodded, feeling the weight of the situation growing. What had started as a routine morning inspection had turned into something much larger, a potential catalyst for change. The regional director's phone rang. He answered it, then looked at James with wide eyes. "It's the CEO. He's heard about what happened and wants to speak with you." James took the phone, aware that all eyes in the restaurant were on him. The simple morning he had planned had transformed into something entirely unexpected, and it was still only lunchtime. James spoke briefly with the CEO, assuring him that he was handling the situation. When he hung up, he handed the phone back to Richard with a thoughtful expression. "The CEO wants to issue a company statement," James told the group at the table. "He also wants me to consider doing an interview." Chief Johnson leaned forward. "Before you make any decisions about that, James, I need to speak with Officer Reed. Would you be willing to be part of that conversation?" James considered the request. "Yes, I think that's important." The chief nodded and went outside to the police car where Reed was waiting. Through the window, James could see them talking. Reed's face changed from defiant to somber as the chief spoke. Finally, Reed nodded, and they both walked back toward the restaurant. As they entered, the restaurant grew quiet again. Customers watched curiously. The news crew that Rick had been keeping at bay stood alert, hoping for something to film. Officer Reed approached the table slowly, his eyes downcast. The chief stood beside him. "Mr. Carter," Reed said stiffly, "Chief Johnson has suggested that I speak with you directly." James gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit down." Reed hesitated, then sat. The chief remained standing, his presence a reminder of the seriousness of the situation. "Officer Reed," James began, "I'd like to understand why you approached me this morning." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "As I said before, there have been break-ins in the area. Your behavior seemed suspicious to me." "What specifically struck you as suspicious?" James pressed. Reed paused before answering. "You were sitting in your car watching the restaurant, taking notes. It looked like you might be planning something." "And did my appearance influence your assessment of the situation?" James asked. "Directly." The restaurant was utterly silent now. Even the kitchen staff had paused to listen. Reed's jaw tightened. "I was responding to behavior, not appearance." "Are you sure about that?" James asked quietly. "Would you have approached a white man in a business suit doing the same thing?" Reed didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "I'd like to think I would," he finally said. "But you're not sure," James observed. Reed looked up, meeting James's eyes for the first time. "No, I'm not sure." The simple admission hung in the air. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a moment of honesty. James turned to address the restaurant at large. For the first time that day, he felt it was appropriate to fully identify himself. "For those who don't know me," he said in a clear voice that carried throughout the space, "my name is James Carter. I own this McDonald's franchise, along with 99 others across the state. A murmur ran through the restaurant. Some customers looked surprised. Others nodded as if having their suspicions confirmed. "I started as a crew member at McDonald's when I was 16, James continued. "I worked my way up to manager, then saved enough to buy my first franchise 20 years ago. Today, my restaurants employ over 3,000 people." He paused, looking around the room at all the faces watching him. "What happened here this morning happens to black people every day. The only difference is that I have resources and connections that many others don't." James turned back to Officer Reed. "I don't want your badge. That wouldn't solve the real problem. What I want is for you to understand the impact of your actions and assumptions." Reed looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. The news crew had somehow made it past Rick and was filming from near the door. James noticed them, but decided not to object. Perhaps this was a story that needed to be told. "Sarah," James called to the manager. "Could you come over here for a moment?" Sarah approached. Nervously, "I want to thank you and your team," James said. You handled a difficult situation professionally. I'm impressed by the team you're building here." Sarah's face lit up with relief and pride. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot." "I'd also like to thank young Marcus," James added, nodding toward the employee who had recognized him. "Your courage in speaking up was important today." Marcus blushed and smiled shyly. James turned back to the executives at the table. "Richard, I think it's time to make a statement, but not just about what happened today. I want to announce a new initiative." Richard looked intrigued. "What kind of initiative?" "A partnership between my restaurants and the police department," James explained. "Community outreach, youth programs, and implicit bias training, funded by me personally." Chief Johnson's eyebrows rose. "That's generous, James. But are you sure that's how you want to respond to what happened today?" "I'm sure," James replied, firmly. Turning a negative into a positive is more productive than simply demanding punishment. He looked at Officer Reed. "And I'd like Officer Reed to be involved in developing the program. His perspective would be valuable." Reed looked stunned. "You want me to be part of this? After what happened?" "Especially because of what happened," James said. "Real change comes from understanding, not exclusion." Amanda, the legal counsel, looked impressed. "That's a remarkable approach, Mr. Carter. I'll have my team draft up a framework for the partnership." Immediately, the news crew had moved closer, clearly capturing everything. Rick finally managed to reach them. "Mr. Carter," he said urgently, "they're broadcasting live." James nodded calmly. "That's fine, Rick." He stood up and approached the news crew directly. The reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes, immediately thrust a microphone toward him. "Mr. Preeser, Carter, can you tell us what happened here today?" she asked eagerly. James looked directly into the camera. "What happened today is sadly common. But what happens next doesn't have to be. I'm announcing a new partnership between my company and the police department aimed at improving community relations and addressing implicit bias." The reporter looked surprised by this positive turn. "That's your response to being profiled and almost forcibly removed from your own restaurant?" James nodded. Progress doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from creating opportunities for understanding and change. He gestured around the restaurant at the diverse group of customers and employees watching. Everyone here witnessed something today. Now we all have a choice about what to do with that experience. As James continued, speaking to the reporter, explaining his vision for the new initiative, Officer Reed watched with a complex expression. For the first time, he was seeing James Carter not as a suspicious figure, but as a leader with dignity and wisdom. The revelation was written clearly on his face. 1 month later, James Carter walked through the same McDonald's doors on Maple Street. The restaurant looked different now. The worn floor tiles had been replaced. The booths had new seats. The once faded sign outside shone brightly in the morning sun. But the biggest changes weren't physical. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," several employees called out as he entered. James smiled and greeted each one by name. Since the incident, he had made a point of visiting this location weekly. He knew every staff member now, and they knew him. Sarah, the manager, emerged from the back office. "Right on time, Mr. Carter. They're waiting for you in the community room." The community room was new, a former storage area converted into a small meeting space. James had installed them in all his restaurants as part of his new initiative. He made his way to the back of the restaurant, greeting customers as he went. Many recognized him now, not just as the owner, but as the man from the news story that had indeed gone national. James opened the door to find Officer Thomas Reed sitting at a table with 6 teenagers. They were all wearing McDonald's uniforms. "Mr. Carter's here," one of the teens announced. Reed stood up. "Good morning, James." The formality that had existed between them had faded over the past month. They weren't exactly friends, but they had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect. "How's our youth employment program going?" James asked, taking a seat at the table. "Really well," Reed replied. "These 6 have completed their first month of training." James looked at the teens proudly. They were all from challenging neighborhoods, recommended by schools and community centers. The program provided them with job skills, mentorship, and a path to future opportunities. "How are you all finding the experience?" James asked them. "It's cool," said a young girl named Tasha. "I didn't think I'd like working here, but it's teaching me a lot. Officer Reed helped me with my college application yesterday," added a boy named Deshaun. "I might be the first in my family to go." Reed looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. It was still new to him, being seen as a mentor rather than just an authority figure. After the incident, Reed had faced disciplinary action, a 2-week suspension, and mandatory training. But instead of fighting it, he had accepted the consequences and volunteered to participate in James's community initiative. Now, 3 days. Each week, Reed spent time in different McDonald's locations, working with young people from the community and helping build better relationships between police and residents. "The chief wants an update on the program next week," Reed informed James. "Numbers look good. Juvenile arrests in the neighborhoods around your restaurants are down 15% since we started." James nodded, pleased but not surprised. When you give young people opportunities and respect, they respond. As the teens returned to work, James and Reed walked together through the restaurant. "Your wife called the precinct yesterday," Reed mentioned. "She's organizing that free medical clinic at your West Side location next month. The department's sending 10 officers to help with security and health screenings." James smiled. Maya had thrown herself into the initiative with enthusiasm, coordinating with other doctors to provide free medical services in underserved areas. "How's your son doing?" James asked. "Tyler, right?" Reed's expression softened. "Better. That mentorship program you suggested is making a difference. He's actually talking to me again." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. A young black teenager had entered the restaurant, looking nervous and uncertain. He stood just inside the door, glancing around as if considering whether to stay or leave. James noticed how Reed tensed slightly, an old habit. But then, deliberately, the officer relaxed his posture. Progress, James thought. Small steps, but progress nonetheless. "I'll handle this," James said quietly. He approached the boy with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" The teenager looked startled, to be addressed directly. I heard you might be hiring?" "We're always looking for good people," James replied. "Do you have experience?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. This would be my first job, but I'm a hard worker." James saw something of himself in the boy's nervous determination. "What's your name?" "Darius Jackson, sir." "Well, Darius Jackson, let me get you an application." James guided him to a table. "While you fill it out, can I get you something to eat? On the house?" Darius looked surprised but grateful. "A burger would be nice, thank you." As James went to order the food, he passed Reed, who had been watching the interaction. "That could have been me 30 years ago," James said quietly, scared but trying not to show it, hoping someone would give me a chance. Reed nodded thoughtfully. "I'm trying to see things differently now." He paused. "It's not always easy to change how you think." "Change never is," James agreed, "but it's always possible." Later that afternoon, James returned to his office at company headquarters. The AVT walls were lined with photos, not of celebrities or awards, but of his restaurants and the people who worked in them. His assistant knocked on the open door. "Your wife called. She'll meet you at the charity dinner tonight." James thanked her and turned back to his computer. The screen showed an email from a national news program requesting an interview about the success of his police community initiative. It had been picked up by several cities across the country. What had started as an ugly incident had transformed into something powerful and positive. The story had resonated with people because it offered something rare, not just a problem, but a solution. James's phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Saw the news. So proud of you. Love you." He smiled and typed back, "Love you too. See you tonight." As he prepared to leave the office, James thought about Darius, the nervous teenager applying for his first job. He thought about Officer Reed, working to overcome years of ingrained assumptions. He thought about all the small moments that could either divide people or bring them together. Everyone deserves a chance to build their future, James thought. No one can tell what you might achieve just by looking at you. That had always been true. The difference now was that more people were starting to understand it. Thanks for joining me for A Lesson in Assumptions. I hope this story resonated with you today. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story about overcoming prejudice and creating positive change, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I share thought-provoking stories like this one regularly, and your support helps me continue creating content that matters. Remember, small actions can lead to big changes. Let's spread kindness in our communities every day, just like James Carter did. Where will you make a difference today? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.